The story of the soldier who carried a piano into battle doesn't start on a peaceful day, or in a warm living room, or inside a quiet music hall. It begins in the middle of a burning Ukrainian city, where German shells were falling so fast that the sky barely stayed dark for more than a second. The air smelled of fire, crushed brick, and fear. Soldiers were sprinting through streets that were no longer streets, only trenches of rubble and shattered glass. And somewhere inside this chaos, a young school teacher turned soldier named Ilarion Kovtun was running for his life, holding nothing but a radio pack, a rifle he barely knew how to reload, and a heart that still hadn't accepted he was in a world war. He had lost his classroom weeks earlier, lost half his friends days ago, and now he was close to losing the last thing that reminded him of who he used to be. That's when the shell hit a building so violently that the shock wave threw him to the ground. He staggered to his feet, coughing, brushing plaster from his hair, expecting more explosions. Instead, what he heard was something he never imagined hearing in a city being torn apart: a musical note. One single, trembling note. A sound that didn't fit here, didn't belong here, and yet sliced through the smoke like a memory trying to survive. Ilarion followed it without thinking, stepping over beams, crawling under hanging wires, until he entered what was left of a demolished music school. The ceiling had collapsed, windows were blown out, and every instrument was crushed, except one: a piano. Standing upright in the middle of destruction, as if the war had somehow missed it on purpose. Its lid was cracked, its legs splintered, and plaster dust covered every inch of it, but it was still whole. And on the nameplate, barely visible under ash, was a name every Ukrainian child grew up hearing: Lysenko, Mykola Lysenko. The man whose melodies shaped a nation long before tanks and dictators tried to silence it. Ilarion pressed a key. The note came out warped, thin, shaking, but alive. In that instant, in a city collapsing around him, something inside him snapped into a strange, fierce clarity. If everything else was being erased, culture, childhood, identity, then this piano could not fall next. If he let it stay here, it would be looted, burned, or crushed under the next artillery strike. So he did something no commanding officer, no military manual, no sane soldier would ever approve. He wrapped his arms around the cracked wooden frame and dragged the piano toward the street, while German tanks rolled closer, while aircraft circled above, while every second screamed at him to run. He didn't care. He had just found the last surviving piece of his world, and he wasn't going to let the war take it too.
Dragging a piano out of a collapsing city was madness, and everyone who saw Ilarion doing it reacted exactly as expected for a man who looked like he'd lost his mind. Soldiers sprinting past him yelled for him to drop it. Civilians hiding in doorways stared in disbelief. Even his own commander, Captain Sidorov, froze for a second when he saw one of his signalmen pulling a piano through smoke like it was an injured comrade. "Have you gone insane?" Sidorov shouted, grabbing Ilarion by the collar. But Ilarion didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't try to justify anything. He simply said, "Sir, this one thing still sounds alive." It wasn't strategy, it wasn't logic, it was instinct. An instinct to save something human when everything human was dying. Sidorov cursed him, called him a fool, threatened to leave him behind. But the firefight was closing in fast, and the unit was desperate to move. So, in a moment of exhausted surrender, the captain ordered 2 men to help Ilarion. "Fine, push your ridiculous piano, but if it slows us down, I will burn it myself." They strapped ropes around the instrument, tied it to a crushed metal door they used as a makeshift sled, and dragged it out of Chernihiv, while German artillery lit the skyline orange behind them. Every bump, every explosion, every fall threatened to break the instrument to pieces, but somehow it held together. Hours later, the unit reached a forest clearing where the smoke thinned enough for the soldiers to catch their breath. Most fell to the ground, shaking from adrenaline, hunger, and the cold terror clinging to their bones. But Ilarion went straight to the piano. He scraped off the ash, sat on a chunk of fallen stone, and pressed a key. Then another. A melody rose into the night, a melody cracked, fragile, wobbly, but unmistakably alive. The sound drifted through the trees like a ghost returning to a place it once knew. At first, the soldiers didn't react. They were too tired, too numb. But one by one, the men turned their heads. One removed his helmet, another sat up straighter, a third covered his face with his hands. These weren't just notes. These were memories, weddings, summer fields, festivals, mothers humming to their children. All of it came rushing back through music in a way gunfire could never erase. For the first time since the invasion began, the men felt something other than fear. Even Sidorov stood in the shadows, pretending to check his map while secretly listening. None of them said a word, but everyone felt the same silent understanding. This piano had no place in a war, yet somehow it was exactly what the war had been missing. But while the soldiers felt hope, the enemy heard something else entirely. German patrols had noticed unusual reports, a Soviet unit moving through forests with a piano. At first, officers laughed. Then someone realized what it meant. A unit that still carried music was a unit that hadn't broken. And in war, a unit that refuses to break becomes a threat worth hunting.
The piano became a rumor before it became a target. German radio intercept teams kept catching strange chatter, reports of a Soviet signal unit carrying a musical instrument across forests and abandoned roads. At first, it sounded like a mistranslation, then like a joke. But when 3 separate patrols confirmed it, officers realized they weren't dealing with a piece of equipment. They were dealing with morale, the one thing that could keep a small, undersupplied Soviet unit fighting long after logic said they should have collapsed. Meanwhile, Ilyaron and his comrades continued moving through winter-bitten terrain, dragging the piano across frozen mud and silent valleys where entire villages had vanished under smoke. The soldiers had stopped complaining. They no longer mocked the piano or judged Ilyaron. Instead, they guarded it. When they set up camp, they placed it between 2 large pines so it wouldn't be seen by passing planes. When they marched, they rotated carrying duties the same way they rotated carrying ammo crates. The piano wasn't a burden anymore. It was a heartbeat. And the deeper the war dragged them, the more that heartbeat mattered. One night, as temperatures sank below freezing, the unit sheltered inside an abandoned farmhouse. Half the roof was missing. Wind sliced through the broken windows. The piano, battered and scarred, leaned against a beam. Ilyaron played quietly, trying not to draw attention. The melody drifted like warm breath in cold air. Soldiers lay on the floor, wrapped in coats, eyes closed, their rifles beside them. Some whispered the names of their families. Some stared into the darkest corners, fighting sleep because nightmares came too quickly. Yet, for a moment, the world felt human again. Then the ground shook, not from artillery, but footsteps. German scouts had been tracking them for 2 days. The music, for all its comfort, had betrayed their position. Ilyaron stopped playing mid-note as the soldiers scrambled to form a perimeter. Sidorov cursed himself for letting them grow careless. They extinguished their lanterns and crouched in silence. Outside, snow crunched under heavy boots.
The piano stood in the middle of the room like a glowing secret, like a piece of the past refusing to hide. The enemy was close, too close, and this time the piano wasn't just a symbol. It was a beacon the enemy intended to capture or destroy.
The German patrol didn't attack immediately. Instead, they waited, forming a ring around the farmhouse to trap the unit inside. Sidorov, realizing the danger, motioned for his men to stay low and silent. But Ilarion couldn't take his eyes off the piano. He knew if they were surrounded, the instrument would be the first thing the Germans smashed, because destroying culture was always more effective than destroying bodies. It was the kind of loss a nation couldn't easily rebuild. The wind whistled through cracked wooden boards as the Germans moved closer, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. One beam drifted across the shattered doorway, inches from revealing the soldiers inside. Ilarion's breath froze in his throat. Sidorov placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "If they enter, we retreat to the tree line. You leave the piano." Ilarion felt like he'd been shot. Leave the piano? Abandon the last living sound of a world before war? He shook his head, quietly, firmly. Sidorov stared at him, realizing the man who once trembled at gunfire was now willing to risk death for a cracked old instrument. The Germans whispered among themselves. One officer stepped forward, raising his flashlight. The beam crept across the floor toward the piano. At that moment, the farmhouse door exploded inward as Sidorov gave the only order that could save them: break through the weakest side and run. The soldiers burst through a back wall, splintering wood as bullets tore through the air behind them. Snow erupted under machine gun fire. The piano sled flicked, crashing into the frozen earth. Ilarion screamed. Not from pain, but from the fear of losing the only piece of beauty left in this nightmare. Two soldiers grabbed him by the arms, dragging him toward the tree line, but he twisted free, sprinting back toward the overturned piano as gunfire stitched the ground at his feet. He reached it, slammed his shoulder under the frame, and heaved with everything left in his shaking body. Another soldier joined him, then another. Under fire, under freezing wind, they lifted the piano upright and dragged it into the woods while German voices shouted and flames from burning torches lit the night like a funeral. Somehow, impossibly, the piano survived again. The soldiers collapsed behind a ridge, gasping, bleeding, shaking. But the piano was there, and that made survival feel possible, even if just barely.
The next day, the unit moved deeper into the forest, navigating through ice-thick streams and narrow ravines where sound vanished into the trees. Everyone expected the piano to fall apart after the last attack. It had survived mortar strikes, artillery shockwaves, and now machine gun fire. Yet when Ilarion lifted the lid and pressed a key, a faint, trembling note emerged. The soldiers stared in disbelief. Something that fragile shouldn't have survived this long. Something that soft should have been crushed by the world's violence. And yet it endured, as if refusing to let war be the final sound. That afternoon, they reached a small hill overlooking a frozen plain. Smoke from distant villages drifted across the horizon. The war was spreading in every direction. Supplies were thin, reinforcements were miles away, but morale, strangely, was holding together in a way Sidorov couldn't explain. That evening, as snow fell quietly over the camp, Ilarion played again. The sound was fragile, missing notes, wobbling in pitch, but the music carried a raw honesty the men desperately needed. It was a reminder that they weren't just soldiers. They were sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. Each man carried a story deeper than the uniform he wore.
Civilians hiding in nearby woods approached slowly, drawn by the sound. They stood at a distance, listening. Some cried softly. Some held hands over their hearts. One elderly man whispered to Sidorov, "If they hear music, it means your men haven't become animals. You're still human. That means you can still win." But humanity had a price, because the Germans were still hunting them, and the more the piano played, the closer the enemy came. The soldiers knew it. Ilarion knew it. Even the commander knew it. Yet no one asked him to stop. In a war designed to erase identity, the piano had become their last defense against becoming hollow. It wasn't just wood and strings anymore. It was the flag they carried when they no longer had a flag left to raise.
Snowstorms slowed the war, but not the hunt. German patrols kept tightening the circle, following broken branches, sled tracks, and abandoned campfire stones. They didn't know exactly why this Soviet unit guarded a piano like treasure, but they understood morale better than most people realized. A group that still carried music was a group that refused to collapse, and if they refused to collapse, they were dangerous. Meanwhile, Ilarion's unit pushed deeper into terrain that barely qualified as safe. The forest became thicker, the rivers colder, and the silence heavier. Whenever they stopped, the men built small fires hidden under rock overhangs to avoid detection. Before sleep, they always checked on the piano as if it were one of their wounded. One night, after a 20-hour forced march, the soldiers took shelter in a ravine surrounded by black pines. The wind howled above them like the cries of the dead. Some men collapsed and immediately slept, boots still on. Ilarion sat beside the piano, staring at it in the moonlit darkness. He wasn't thinking of glory or heroism. He was thinking of the children he used to teach. Children who used to gather around the school piano to sing folk songs older than any empire. He wondered where they were now, if they were alive, if they remembered the melodies. Slowly, he lifted the lid and played a quiet arrangement of Lysenko's Prayer for Ukraine, barely audible above the wind. The notes sounded like they were trembling from exhaustion, the same way every man in the unit trembled. But even in that fragile form, the music felt like a shield of light in a pit of blackness. It reached the soldiers first. They opened their eyes, listening, breathing more evenly. Then it reached the civilians hidden in the woods, giving them a few minutes of peace. And finally, it reached someone else. A German sniper team, positioned on a ridge, scouting for targets. They didn't fire. Not yet. One of them whispered, "It's the piano unit. They're close." Orders had been clear. Capture the piano if possible, destroy it if necessary. The sniper lowered his rifle. They needed the rest of the platoon. But the message was delivered, and the circle around Ilarion's unit tightened again. When the music faded, the men slept without knowing the enemy was listening from the treetops. Only Sidorov sensed something wrong. He stayed awake until dawn, staring into the shifting shadows of the forest, knowing that beauty had a cost, and they would soon have to pay it.
The attack came 2 days later, just as the unit crossed a frozen river whose surface cracked like thin glass under their boots. They heard nothing at first. No engines, no shouts, just the eerie quiet that sometimes comes before a storm. Then a flare burst over the tree line, washing the snow in a pale green glow. German machine guns opened fire from both banks, The soldiers scattered, slipping across the ice while bullets shattered the river's surface into exploding shards. Sidorov shouted orders, trying to coordinate a defense, but the ambush had been planned too well. The enemy wasn't interested in wiping them out in seconds. They wanted to push them into a funnel, trap them, force them to surrender. The piano, strapped to its sled, slid dangerously near a crack in the ice. Ilarion saw it tipping and sprinted through incoming fire to grab the rope. The ice groaned beneath him. A bullet struck inches from his hand, sending fragments of ice cutting into his skin. But he held on, dragging the piano away from the growing fracture. The soldiers fired back, moving in a staggered retreat. Snow erupted around them as mortar rounds landed too close for comfort. Ilarion and 3 others worked in frantic silence to pull the piano toward the far bank. It was no longer about music, it was about survival. If the piano fell through the ice, the men knew Ilarion would jump in after it. And if he jumped in, 2 or 3 would dive in after him. That's how war bonds worked. That's how impossible burdens became shared ones. A shell exploded on the riverbank, knocking Ilarion off his feet. His ears rang, his vision blurred. Through the haze, he saw German troops closing in, rifles raised. The piano sled was stuck against a mound of broken ice, refusing to move. One soldier grabbed Ilarion's coat, dragging him up. Another threw his body against the sled. A third fired cover shots from behind a fallen tree. Inch by inch, the piano moved, scraping, sliding, fighting the very idea of being saved, until it finally crossed the river and hit solid ground on the opposite side. The soldiers didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They simply kept running, because the Germans were not stopping. They wanted the piano. They wanted the symbol. They wanted the morale it carried. And Ilarion's unit was now openly defying that. In the chaos, Ilarion looked back at the river, watching German troops spread across the ice like shadows. He didn't know how long they could keep the piano alive, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. As long as it lived, so did a piece of what they were fighting for.
After the ambush, the unit reached an abandoned monastery deep in the forest. Its stone walls were cracked, its bell tower leaning, and its halls filled with dust thick enough to erase footsteps. But it was shelter, real shelter, for the first time in weeks. The men barricaded the entrances, set up watch posts, and used broken pews as firewood. The piano was placed in the old chapel, where moonlight from a shattered window fell across the keys like a spotlight on a forgotten stage. It looked almost holy there, almost destined. Ilarion approached it like a man approaching a wounded friend. The lid was chipped from bullets, the frame was warped from cold. 3 strings had snapped. He pressed a key. It made no sound. He pressed another. A faint tone emerged, coarse but alive. The soldiers gathered slowly, forming a half-circle around the instrument. They were exhausted, hungry, bruised. But in that moment, every one of them watched Ilarion with the same hope they used to save for letters from home. He began to play. The chapel filled with a melody that didn't sound like a piano anymore. It sounded like a survivor breathing through broken lungs. And yet it was beautiful. The echoes bounced off stone walls, weaving through fallen icons and shattered glass. Civilians hiding in nearby woods drifted into the chapel doorway, listening with hands over their mouths. For the first time since the invasion, someone lit a candle and placed it beside the piano. Then another, and another. Soon the entire chapel flickered with small flames,
making the piano look like an altar to everything the war had tried to erase. Word spread. Other Soviet units moving through the region heard about the piano soldiers. Some laughed, some shook their heads, but many felt something shift inside them, a reminder that the war hadn't crushed everything that made them human. In a brutal conflict where propaganda, fear, and starvation were used as weapons, the idea that one group of men carried a piano across battlefields became a spark of hope, a rumor that reminded scattered soldiers that their nation still lived inside its culture. But hope also created a tension, and a tension in war was a double-edged blade. Somewhere beyond the tree line, German officers learned the piano had reached the monastery. They were no longer amused by the story. They saw it as a symbol that needed to be destroyed, a message that needed to be silenced, and they began preparing for the assault that would decide the piano's fate for good. The Germans attacked the monastery at dawn, choosing the 1 hour when exhaustion is deepest and reflexes are slowest. The first shell struck the bell tower, knocking loose centuries-old stones that crashed into the courtyard like falling thunder. The second shell hit the outer wall, blasting open a breach big enough for infantry to pour through. Sidorov woke before the explosion finished echoing. He grabbed his rifle, kicked the nearest soldier awake, and shouted for everyone to take defensive positions. Ileron darted to the chapel, heart pounding, not to save his rifle or pack, but to save the piano. It stood in the candlelit room like a survivor frozen in prayer, untouched but vulnerable. He reached it just as another blast shook the ground, knocking dust from the rafters. The candles flickered wildly, throwing shadows across the cracked keys. Outside, gunfire erupted, short bursts, shouted commands, boots slamming through snow. The Germans were coming fast. The soldiers formed a perimeter, firing from windows, doorways, and broken arches. Civilians fled through a narrow passage behind the monastery, guided by 2 riflemen assigned to protect them. In the chaos, Ileron's eyes never left the piano. He knew the enemy wanted it gone. They wanted the story erased before it inspired anyone else. Sidorov stormed into the chapel, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, and grabbed Ileron by the arm. "We can't hold them here. We need to retreat deeper into the forest." Ileron nodded, but his gaze dropped to the piano. Sidorov sighed, understanding without a word. He called 2 soldiers to help lift it. They struggled, slipping on broken tiles, but managed to drag the sled toward the rear corridor. The Germans breached the courtyard, shouting as they advanced. Rifle fire cracked like breaking branches. A machine gun opened up from the bell tower ruins, spraying stone fragments. One German soldier spotted the retreating group and shouted to his squad, "The piano! Stop them!" The sound of that command hit the soldiers harder than the gunfire. It confirmed everything. They weren't imagining the importance of what they carried. The enemy wanted the piano for the same reason they did. It was a symbol that had survived too much to be allowed to keep surviving. The soldiers pushed deeper into the monastery, pulling the piano toward a narrow lower exit that led into the trees. A grenade bounced into the hallway. One of the soldiers threw himself over it without hesitation. The explosion shook the walls and filled the corridor with smoke. Ileron screamed his name, but the man was gone. There was no time to mourn. Sidorov, eyes red, jaw clenched, dragged Ileron forward. "His sacrifice means nothing if you stop now. Move!" They burst out of the building into the icy forest, breath turning to steam, snow flying under their boots. Behind them, the monastery burned. Flames consumed the chapel. The bell tower collapsed, and above the roar of fire, German voices shouted orders to give chase. Ileron looked back once, seeing the place where the piano had stood, bathed in candlelight just hours earlier. Now it was smoke and ruin. There was only one way to honor everything that had happened. Keep going.
keep the piano alive, keep the story alive, even as the forest closed behind them and the enemy closed in ahead.
The final stand happened at the edge of a frozen clearing, where the forest dipped into a ravine threaded with a small river. The soldiers were exhausted, half frozen, and low on ammunition. The piano sled got stuck against a fallen tree, refusing to budge. Hilarion dropped to his knees, pushing, pulling, pleading with the instrument to move just one more time. But war had finally caught up with them. German troops emerged from the tree line, rifles raised, boots crunching in slow, steady steps. Sidorov stood between the enemy and the piano, firing controlled shots until his rifle clicked empty. He didn't step back. 2 soldiers beside him did the same. The Germans shouted for them to surrender. No one answered. Hilarion rose slowly, standing in front of the piano like a guardian shielding a relic. For a long moment, the battlefield froze, not in silence, but in the quiet between breaths. Snow drifted. Smoke curled upward. The river whispered under its crust of ice. A German officer stepped forward, confused, almost stunned. "You carry a piano?" Hilarion didn't speak. He simply placed his hands on the keys. The officer frowned, raising his weapon, unsure if he was witnessing insanity or defiance. Then Hilarion played. The sound was weak, cracked, barely alive, yet it carried. It drifted through the cold air like a dying heartbeat refusing to stop. The soldiers on both sides stood still, mesmerized by the impossible sight of a man playing music in the middle of a battlefield. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody fired. Even the officer lowered his rifle, his face tightening with something that looked almost like respect, or confusion, or fear. But the moment couldn't last. Another officer shouted angrily from the rear, ordering his men to finish the fight. Gunfire erupted. Sidorov shoved Hilarion aside as bullets tore through the air. One hit the piano, ripping a hole through its side. Another shattered the top board. Finally, a third tore through the soundboard, ending the melody in a harsh, abrupt gasp of broken strings. The piano collapsed onto the snow, splintering into pieces. Hilarion dropped beside it, trembling, staring at the ruin that had survived so much only to fall here. The Germans, seeing the instrument destroyed, halted their advance. The symbol was gone. Their objective was complete. They turned away, leaving the exhausted, wounded Soviet soldiers in the frozen clearing. Hours later, reinforcements found Hilarion still sitting beside the shattered piano, hands resting on the broken keys. He wasn't crying. He wasn't speaking. He was simply listening to something only he could still hear, the echo of a melody that refused to die. The soldiers buried the piano beneath the snow, marking the spot with branches. Hilarion refused to leave until a last clump of earth was placed. In the years that followed, people spoke of many legends from the war, but one of the strangest, most persistent stories was about the man who carried a piano into battle. Not because he was ordered to, not because it made sense, but because sometimes the only way to survive a world trying to erase you is to carry the last sound of who you are, even into the fire.